Hi, I'm Ashton, and today is kind of like a Patches and Parley, if you remember those videos, where I do like a handcraft and talk about something related to politics. But in this one, I'm going to be crocheting, and we're going to talk about fast fashion, as you can probably tell from the title. I'm crocheting a cat bed for my partner's mom's cat. I'm still like a novice crocheter, I would say. If you are currently working on any handcraft projects, craft or art or whatever, you should pick it up and do it with me, because I think that would be fun. So I don't really talk about like fashion as a whole a lot on the internet. It's something that I'm interested in, but it's not something that I like produce content about a lot, you know? But I think fast fashion is such an interesting example of the ways that like capitalism ruins everything, basically. Fast fashion as a whole is just so like ripe for conversation in so many different ways, and I have some notes that I'm going to go through, but essentially my thesis is just that like fast fashion is a symptom of a much bigger problem. It relies on so many different methods of exploitation, if that makes sense. And I want to talk through some of them and kind of discuss the ways that they intersect and the complicated discussions that can come out of them, and some like misconceptions or misinterpretations of the ways that people talk about fast fashion, as well as like industry and capitalism in general. So that's what I want to discuss today. If you hear kitty cat noises in the background, that is my cat. If you want to learn more about her, you can watch my next video, which is a little like life update thing. It's not all about the cat. Right off the bat, this video was inspired by like a handful of other videos that I've watched recently, so I want to credit them right away and make sure you know that I have put them in the description and that I for sure recommend watching them, but none of them are like prerequisites to this video. They're just things that you may be interested in if you enjoy this video and or the discussions surrounding fast fashion as a whole. The first one is a video that Nisi Pisa made about thrifting, where she just shows off her thrift haul, but like accumulated over the years. And it's not about like the haul in general, but she makes some really like well thought out points about fashion consumption and how we discuss it as a whole. And I would just recommend watching it. It's a fun video, but like she definitely has some very insightful commentary on fast fashion and social media. So that was my first little recommendation. Tiffany Ferg also recently-ish made a video on fast fashion that I watched and made me think about this. And then I also recently watched 2 videos on why crochet cannot be made by machines. And that's why I'm crocheting in this video, and I will talk a little bit more about crochet later, but I think that is such an interesting rabbit hole to go down, and I will link those 2 videos in the description. Hopefully I can find them. And then it was also inspired by, I'm sure some of you also saw this, the recent like discussions about Shein because of the Shein influencer trip that happened, where I won't go too deep into it, but if you're not familiar, a bunch of, well, I think like 3 main influencers, but one of them is really getting dragged for it, went to a Shein factory, quote unquote, that people are assuming is really just their sample production. Basically, Shein showed this like model factory to these influencers, and these influencers were like, look at how well maintained and clean these areas are, ignoring that there were still a lot of problems with those factories, including a lack of emergency exit signage, a lack of fire blankets, which are needed when you are working with garments on like a large scale industrial machines, a lack of safety signage in general, which is also something that you should have in pretty much every factory ever. And I'm not gonna get super into it, but it has had me thinking about fast fashion for obvious reasons. There are for sure like a lot of videos about fast fashion on the internet, and I don't want to pretend that I'm doing anything like groundbreaking or revolutionary with this one. I just want to provide like an explicitly anti-capitalist take on it, and kind of draw some connections that have been made, but I wish people were more explicit about the fact that all of these things are interconnected and it is not a single issue problem. And I think examining fast fashion, as well as, you know, a variety of other cultural phenomenon, can help us understand capitalism and the ways that it acts to hurt everyone. So super positive video, I know, but I think it's interesting, and I think some of you will hopefully think it's interesting as well. I guess I should start by giving like a relatively basic primer about what fast fashion is. But fast fashion is a way of describing the mass production of clothing, garments, while attempting to keep up with a very, very, very fast trend cycle. The garments are produced really, really fast. They are shipped as quickly as possible. There are constantly new designs coming out. Generally, consumers will buy things quickly. There's always sales going on, and people will also throw these garments away quickly because that trend cycle is so fast. If you're buying fast fashion for a trend, in a week it's going to be over and you're just going to buy more clothes. That is like a basic overview. Anyway, I think it's really interesting because it weaves together so many different topics and struggles, and I wanted to give like a brief overview of 4 of like the main ones that I see discussed, and we'll talk about more different ones as we kind of go along. My hope in this video is that I can show you the way that one topic can be influenced by a bunch of different little things that all boil down to exploitation. It's not like a happy conclusion, but it's the truth. The first little bit topic I want to touch on is the environmentalism aspect. Fashion is maybe obviously like a massively polluting industry, especially because fast fashion mimics really, really quick trend cycles, so clothes get thrown away. And on top of that, a lot of fast fashion pieces, because they're made as quickly and cheaply as possible, are not long lasting or they're hard to mend, so they get thrown away, and that contributes to it, obviously. There are dozens and probably hundreds of wild pictures of just piles and mountains of clothes. And a lot of that waste comes from fast fashion. That also connects really directly to overconsumption. I want to try to explain this without going too deep into the Marxist weeds, but like know that there is a very Marxist analysis here about individualism and the toxicity of consumerist culture playing into our identities and the way that we buy things as a method of self-expression when that's not really what self-expression should be about. Anyway, overconsumption and the culture of buy more all the time definitely plays into how big of a pollutant fast fashion as an industry is, and fashion in general as an industry is, as well as every other industry. When you are encouraged to overconsume, you are going to throw away more things. I feel like that doesn't need to be explained super in depth. The other massively important element that I see discussed some is the devaluation of women's labor. Working with fiber and making garments is something that is traditionally in a lot of cultures, associated with femininity, and feminine crafts are not valued as greatly as masculine ones. You can see this there's a lot of feminist discussion about this topic as a whole, in terms of like the art versus craft distinction. Where that line is drawn in a lot of cases comes down to whether or not something is considered valuable based on who creates it. There's a lot of discussion about that in terms of quilting, especially. There's really interesting scholarship about crafts being women's work and what that means and how that contributes to the devaluation of the art forms. Fast fashion is a really fascinating modern expansion of that, in my opinion. Women were paid for the work that they do in the Shein sweatshops, then fast fashion wouldn't be as fast because it would have to be priced higher and you would have to use safer material. Like, you can't just pay people more and have things be okay. You also have to make the factories safe. You have to like not exploit people, but that's just not how capitalism works. But most fast fashion industry workers, in terms of the people making the garments, are women of color. I'm pretty sure the demographic like data is around 80%, which is massive and hugely telling in terms of who is profiting from these industries and who is being exploited for the industries to run. And the exploitation of primarily women of color also goes back to this other problem that fast fashion largely contributes to, which is like outsourcing and exploitation. Outsourcing you can kind of look at in a lot of different ways, and economists would probably disagree with me, but the vast majority of the time it is a very exploitative process. Outsourcing is a problem in that it allows and benefits from the exploitation of marginalized people in other countries. a lot of the times those people are women of color. In these 4 or 5 right topics, environmentalism and pollution, the devaluation of women's labor, outsourcing, exploitation, and overconsumption are oftentimes discussed as like separate issues with fast fashion, but they're all so deeply connected to each other. And you can't cheaply mass produce clothing without exploiting someone. It's not possible to do cheaply. It takes a lot of work, and someone has to be doing that work, and the majority of the time those people are underpaid. And because of outsourcing, those underpaid people are very frequently overseas, which means higher shipping costs and therefore more pollution. They're all interconnected, right? None of these things are issues, well, they're all problems on their own, right? But they all also exacerbate each other, and I think that's something that needs to be like drilled into people's brain. None of these things can be fought independently. We have to understand them as symptoms of each other and interacting in the complex ways that they do interact, because otherwise your understanding is like not complete. I feel like we've all heard the phrase, right? It's very commonly said in like leftist spaces in general, but also in discussions about fast fashion, that there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, and people use that in a variety of ways. Sometimes it is as an excuse to shop fast fashion in whatever way they like. The way that, in my opinion, it should be used is a bit different than that. It is never a bad thing to be conscious of what you are consuming, but we also all have to recognize that we live under a system that is massively exploitative, and practically everything that we buy is going to come from exploitation. There's practically no way around it. And if you don't understand that as a systemic problem, it's not something that you are able to internalize meaningfully, I think. The phrase, "there's no ethical consumption under capitalism," shouldn't be used to brush away the issues that are very prevalent in practically every industry. It should be used as a method of discussing those things and how we can sometimes minimize that damage, where that damage really comes from, which of course is capitalism, but using it as a way of excusing behavior that is like playing into and reinforcing various oppressive things is not the way to do that. I also feel like a lot of the times it's more complicated than that, because like, what is ethical? So in like garment industry specifically, right? If you think about leather goods, that's a really complicated discussion, and I'm not going to hash it all out here, but obviously leather comes from animals, and a lot of animals are exploited to create that leather. However, replacement leather, fake leather, does not last as long as real leather. Real leather can break down much more like environmentally friendly, but it's also made with chemicals. But so is fake leather, and fake leather is more frequently thrown away because it doesn't last as long as real leather. You can't sew it in the same way. I've worked with both, I would know. So it's a very like multifaceted discussion, and there's no ethical consumption under capitalism doesn't really allow for that, because if you consider both fake leather and leather as unethical options, what are you gonna do? Obviously you can avoid buying leather, and you can also avoid buying fake leather, but I work at a barn, you know? I use leather a lot, even though I'm a vegan, and some vegans would think that's wrong of me, but I would much rather use leather that I didn't create, you know, and take care of it and use it for a very long time, than throw it out or replace all of the leather that we have that's perfectly good, you know? So that's like one of the ways in which I think that statement sometimes fails, by kind of obfuscating the various ways in which things can be ethical versus unethical and how we weigh those different things, because it's complicated. There's also sometimes this like moral high grounding about ethical fashion versus fast fashion and slow fashion, in terms of like people being shamed because they buy things from Amazon or Shein or wherever. And that's also something that is really multifaceted, right? Because there is a massive difference between someone who's a minimum wage worker buying a garment from Amazon because it's what they can afford, it's what's accessible to them, they need new clothes, right? There's a difference between that and like influencer hundreds of thousands of dollars being put into these companies, like massive hauls that also promote the companies, right? There's a difference between like using what you can afford, being low income and doing these things, right? Versus like having a massive budget for fashion and spending it all on Shein. Those are two very different things. There's such a distinct difference between someone who needs to buy cheap clothes because they need to put clothes on their back and someone who buys cheap clothes for fun. And it's an issue of consumerism, right? But it's also an issue of class. And I think that in discussions about fast fashion, a lot of the times that's ignored and people are shamed for buying clothes regardless of the circumstances they are in, when that should not be the case. It creates this kind of cyclical problem of like buying into ethics where people assume that you always have a choice in what you can buy, and not everyone does. At the end of the day, it is very much a privilege to be able to buy things ethically, whether that is secondhand. Not everyone has secondhand shops around them. Not everyone can afford to put time into that. Not everyone can do fashion ethically, and that's something that we have to accept while also understanding that that is not that person's fault. This also, I think, is a really interesting connection to the being poor is expensive idea, which, if you're not familiar, the example that's used a lot is boots. Because, you know, if you need boots for work, and you can only afford to buy $10 boots, those boots are gonna break in 3 months. But if you buy $100 boots, they might last you a few years. But in the time that those $100 boots have lasted you, you've bought like 30 pairs of the other boots that don't last as long, but are less expensive, but when you add it all up, it's more expensive. Does that make sense? If you're not familiar with the like being poor is expensive idea, that's the gist of it. And I think people view that as a failure of poor people rather than the systemic problem that it is. And if we think about it as a systemic problem, then I think it's a lot easier to understand why some people do need to buy fast fashion. It's simply not accessible for everyone to buy things that are handmade or made slowly or made with sustainable materials, because oftentimes those are more expensive because the people that make them are being paid. Fast fashion is cheap as a function of it. And you can't have cheap fashion that is ethical the majority of the time because people have to make those things. Not everything can be machine done, even though some things can, right? Someone's got to drive the clothing from point A to point B. Someone has to put, I don't know, the seams in and stuff. It can't all be done by machine. And even when it is done by machine, people have to maintain those machines. People have to design the clothing. People have to source the fabric. Like, there's a lot of work that goes into it. And not all of those people are being paid the same, right? It's the person up top that's being paid the overhead. Ethical fashion cannot be cheap, but that doesn't mean that the people who buy cheap fashion are inherently doing something morally corrupt, because there is not always an option. This also leads into another problem of like oversight, where people assume that just because something is expensive, it means it is more ethical, which is definitely not always the case. There are a huge variety of like quote unquote higher end brands that do use sweatshop labor or child labor or a wild assortment of other unethical business practices, and you just don't hear about it as often. The people that can afford to buy luxury things probably also don't care that much. But just because something is priced a little bit higher than Shein doesn't mean that the people that made it are being paid fairly. And I think people overlook that because there's such a scapegoat of the companies like Wish and Temu and Shein and stuff, where those prices are so like horrifically low that you know that person that made it is not being paid enough. But just because something's priced higher doesn't mean that the person who made it was being paid enough. And I think that's something we've all got to keep in mind. There's also this kind of unspoken cognitive load that comes with all of it. Not everyone thinks about the clothes that they buy, and it takes some research and some knowledge and some time to understand what is ethical and what isn't. And not everyone can do that. Not everyone has the time or energy or money to like give yourself 15 minutes to research something like that. And that's also not a failure of the people that can't do that. It's a failure of the system that created that need. There's also this whole other problem of this topic creating a lot of just completely dead-end discussions where people with non-normative bodies are shamed and further marginalized because some of them have to buy fast fashion, it is so much harder to find clothes when you are fat, when you are trans, when you are disabled in a variety of ways, right? Finding clothes that fit you comfortably, fit you affordably, gets more difficult with the more ways that your body is not normative. And those types of people, right, are oftentimes shamed even though there are not slow or ethical options for those people. It's also further complicated by the fact that marginalized groups are a lot more likely to be poor and unable to afford ethical or slow options. So it's a very, very complicated thing. A lot of the times being able to participate in ethical and slow fashion is a privilege. Not everyone can afford or has time to mend things. Going to thrift stores to find stuff that you like can take a lot of time, especially when you're someone that's really picky. And if you need a shirt for a job that starts in a week, you may not have time to find a perfect shirt at a thrift store. You might have to order it from Amazon. And you shouldn't feel bad about that. You should feel angry that you've been forced to be in that situation. You are more than allowed to be angry at the system that created these false dichotomies for you, where something that's ethical is inaccessible. So those are some basic thoughts and nuances for you. I also wanted to talk about two specific subcategories of fashion, because they're the ones that I guess I know the most about, so I find them really interesting and very clear examples of how all of this happens. And one of those is crochet. There is knowledge within the crochet world that you should never ever buy crochet if you don't know how it was made. And generally you should not buy crochet that is cheap. And that is because crochet takes a lot of time. Whereas something knitted can be knitted on a machine, or knitted partially on a machine and embellished otherwise, or knitted on a hand machine, which is much faster than hand knitting, but still is machine aided. Knitting can be aided by machines in a lot of ways. As of yet, and probably for quite some time, crochet cannot be done by machines. So every single crochet piece that has ever been sold, right, was made by hand. And if that crochet piece is being sold in a Forever 21 for $15, the person that made it is not being compensated. There is absolutely no way that the person that made it was ethically compensated. And that's something that pretty much every crocheter knows, because learning crochet takes time and doing it takes a lot of time. And if you've ever made a substantially sized crochet piece, you probably are aware that it takes a lot of time. This cat bed, right, that I'm working on has taken me dozens of hours. And it is gonna be a gift, right? It's not something that I can sell because it would be a couple $100 if I were to pay myself a living wage. And a lot of people that sell their crochet work undersell themselves and underprice their work, because if you were to ask for a living wage when you make a crochet piece, you'd be told that it's not worth that or it's way too expensive. And a part of the reason that people perceive it that way is because crochet pieces have been sold through fast fashion outlets. I see it all the time. You can look up crochet top and see 50 results from Temu, 50 million results from Amazon, results from all sorts of companies with prices $20 and under. Even if the entire cost of the item was going directly to the person that crocheted it, that would not be enough money. That to me is a really clear, explicit example of how women's work is devalued and made into something that is commodified in a really shitty, for lack of a better word, way. But because crochet has been presented to people as a trend, and you get a little top for a cheap $10. And then the other example that I think is an interesting comparison almost is leather goods and kink goods in general, because any kink wear or like leather fashion in general that comes from fast fashion retailers is going to be very bad and very poorly made. Oftentimes it's faux leather, which, as we discussed, doesn't hold together as well, doesn't last any elements as well. You can't take care of it in the same way, it disintegrates. But good leather gear made by like leather workers is a lot more expensive. I follow quite a handful of leather workers, as well as people that work with like latex and vegan leather. And all of those pieces are expensive. But when you think about the time that's put into them and the skill that that craft takes and the materials that that craft requires, they're reasonably priced. And I don't frequently see like queers or kinksters complaining about the prices of those goods, because I think a lot of those types of people understand that. But I think it's an interesting insight that if you find cheap kink gear, it's very similar to if you find cheap crochet. It was probably made under some very unethical conditions, and it might fall apart. Anyway, I just find it a little annoying, infuriating, maybe even, that a lot of the times, oh, my eyelash is falling off. Oh my God, how embarrassing. I feel like mainstream discussions about fast fashion typically leave so much to be desired, because it's a problem that is like directly caused by capitalism. The cheaper the labor is for something, the more the capitalist can make. And that system, that structure, enables things like fast fashion to be so profitable. And it sucks. And I am so put off by seeing discussion after discussion of fast fashion without the consideration of the forces that shape it, and without any sort of care for the people that have to rely on it because there aren't any other options. Especially when it's discussed in like mass media or news outlets, fast fashion is kind of framed as like this monster that kind of no one knows how it got here, but like, what do you mean? You know? The forces that created fast fashion are the same forces that are enabling it to continue existing, and that force is like capitalism and the exploitation of women and the exploitation of people of color and the exploitation of multiply marginalized people and the exploitation of the earth. Like it's all linked together in one big bundle. And if you discuss fast fashion without understanding that it's not a solo problem, it is entangled with so many other problems, I don't think you're doing it justice, because capitalism and the inherent patriarchy that is embedded within it is the reason that fast fashion can thrive the way that it does. And if you discuss it and you try to discuss solutions or ways to mitigate its harms without the knowledge and the recognition and the discussion included of this is why this thing exists, right? This is how this thing continues to profit. It's because the system that we live in enables it, and that system is capitalism. I think the discussion isn't going far enough. I think that so long as we live in a capitalist world, stuff like fast fashion is going to continue to exist, and you can't buy your way out of unethical practices, because the way that everything is created in a system like this one is not going to be ethical. That's all of the notes I have on that topic. I hope that was entertaining. I hope that maybe you learned something. Maybe you have reconsidered throwing out your old favorite clothes. Mending is important and great, and I think that everyone should learn to mend their clothes. All right, well, I always have more things to say on this topic. If you have thoughts or reactions or like further information or anything that I didn't talk about, I would love to discuss this more in the comments, but I have just finished filming 2 videos, so I'm tired. I'm gonna take off my eyelashes and go play with my cat. Hope that you appreciate where your clothing comes from, and I hope that you try to buy slow and ethical when you can, or maybe you create your own garments, which is also sick. Repurpose things, mend things, do what you can, but don't feel bad because you are not the problem, the system is. And work to tear down that system in any way that you possibly can, but know that it is not directly your fault, And just because you are forced with no other options to contribute to it sometimes, that doesn't mean you're a bad person. That just means that you are stuck in capitalism. But there's hope. There's always hope. You gotta have hope. Because otherwise, it would be a pretty fucked up world. So anyway, I hope that you aren't too sad after this whole discussion. I hope that you go learn a new craft or learn to mend your clothes. And I will talk to you later, maybe.